For the newly released Alan Wake sequel, I decided to go headlong into the first game to prepare. For proof, see Exhibit Insanely Long Review right here. However, for me, understanding the story is only half the battle with games, as I enjoy the warm hole in my chest that gets filled every time I see a 100% on my trophy list. If you have aspirations of attaining such glory, then join me as I recant the harrowing adventure. To start, the bulk of this game's trophies are, of course, story-related. Things like completing episodes, beating certain enemies, or performing certain actions will earn you probably half or more of the trophies that this game has to offer. After that, you have the game's many collectables, a few tied to challenges, a few tied to difficulty, and some tied to just using different guns X amount of times. Depending on how you want to approach this game, you may even be able to tie this up in almost a single playthrough. But if you're normal, then this is probably a 2 run-through platinum with some miscellaneous load-ins to specific chapters post-game. For me though, the journey started with a playthrough of the game just to envelop myself in the story and learn the basic mechanics of the game. For the most part, the gameplay here is nothing complex. You have a flashlight, which is used to take invulnerabilities from enemies and to destroy obstacles in your path. Almost everything you can interact with has a certain light threshold that you have to meet before it will go away and you can either attack it or destroy it. The real aspects of the game that you need to get familiar with here though are the dodge mechanic and the effects of the light-based weapons. Things like flares are invaluable. They back off enemies and give you time to breathe in low health situations. The dodge is also very useful. It may not seem like it in the normal mode, but once you graduate to Nightmare, enemies will have higher light thresholds to meet and take more damage. So being able to evade when they close the gap on you is something you need to be accustomed to. Speaking of Nightmare, let's discuss that mode because it's really the first hurdle that you're going to hit in terms of more difficult trophies. Now, I'm not going to tell you that Nightmare is hard, since it really isn't. The only changes to the mode are, like I said, harder enemies, and I think you're also slightly weaker. That's it. In fact, I think you could do this on your first run of the game in Nightmare and not even notice that much of a difference. However, that being said, I realize that my opinion on what constitutes a harsh difficulty may have been somewhat broken after Akumu mode in The Evil Within. So, if you're struggling, allow me to give you some tips that may help you. Firstly, in general, light poles or just lighted areas usually constitute a checkpoint. So if you're ever struggling with a section, you can almost always run past it and go to the next light post because the distance is usually relatively short. Any enemies chasing you will also vanish as soon as you reach the point. Second, flares are your best friend. As I said above, if you slip into the red or are just trying to run past enemies in favor of finding the next light pole, flares will give you a brief window of distance to play around with, as the Taken don't want to deal with the brightness. They're also perfect for lighting generators, since they'll give you enough time to do the button prompts without hindrance. And thirdly, never be afraid of running out of ammo. Unless you're just being insanely reckless, there shouldn't be a point where ammo is going to be an issue for you. After every episode, Alan's going to lose everything that you've acquired anyway, so saving your stuff rarely makes sense. In fact, he often loses his inventory halfway through the episode, so the game is constantly restocking you to balance it out.
Yeah, but let's move! I lost my gun back there. Oh, I've got a gun.
Like I said, I don't think this mode is difficult, but there are some sections that can give you a slight issue. For me, there were 3 or 4, but it was mostly because I tried to conserve. Here on the bridge in episode 2, you encounter your first possessed objects. The area is fairly tight, and these things hit like a truck if they connect. If you have a flare though, you can just run to the far left where you're to exit the area, throw it down, and escape it into the open. It's still a narrow path and the objects still come after you, but I just found that easier. Alternatively, you could also use things like beams to strafe around and keep the objects off you. Another challenging area comes in episode 4 when you arrive at the Andersons' farm. You'll have a big conflict on their rock stage, and it's difficult to keep track of where enemies will be spawning. Most will spawn in front, but from time to time, they'll also come from the sides, and it can derail your strategies. Luckily, this place is packed with equipment, and it's the last real battle of the episode. So just use flares when you get startled, and remember to use the spotlight in the front of the stage as soon as it spawns. Also, pick up the flashlight upgrade to the left side of the stage right at the beginning. Next up comes the lengthy helicopter fight in episode 5. You'll have to fend off hordes of Taken as Sheriff Sarah tries to get the helicopter operational. This may be the most challenging fight in the game, but you do get well stocked for it, so it's still not overly complicated. In my opinion, the stationary lights are almost just a death trap to try and keep operational. Instead, pick up the flashbangs and flares and just start shooting them off. Everything is going to be taken from you after this sequence, so there's absolutely no upside to try and hold anything back. Then, because the game just took everything from you, the upcoming hangar area can also be complicated. However, it can be overcome by just using the few flares that you have and pushing through to the next checkpoint outside the far right door. I really can't see you getting hung up on any of these places for an extended period of time though. The most difficult part for me was the hangar, but it was my own fault because I have the compulsion to clear every area before I move on. But it should also be noted that you don't get anything for killing enemies, so if you can evade them, it's almost always the smartest play. However, depending on how you've crafted your game plan, this could be less simple, which leads us to collectibles. This game has over 10 trophies which are dedicated to the collecting of various things in the world. Be those things manuscript pages, coffee thermoses, hidden chests, can pyramids, radio broadcasts, television broadcasts, or historical signs. I'm not going to go into heavy detail on where everything is, but I'll tell you that almost all of them are in locations that you'll run across if you're explorative. You can also go into episode select and even certain checkpoints if you're following a guide and know the ones that you've missed. To begin with hidden chests, there are 30 of them and they're indicated by luminescent paint arrows that are slathered close to the cache. You'll typically see them along a path and follow it until you hit the chest. Of course, some are hidden better than others. For me, I found this one in episode 5 to be easy to miss because I didn't realize that this fence had a door. You'll go through and all the way around the waterfront building to find the chest at the top of the stairs. I think most are easy to spot though. I believe I was sitting somewhere around 25 after my first playthrough, so if you're actually looking, then chances are you'll find them. Next up is the can pyramids, which are almost certainly the easiest. To start, there are 12 of them in the game, and you'll only need to find and shoot 5 of them to nab the Carney trophy. Almost all of them are right along your path, so as long as you remember what you've got to do, then you shouldn't have any issues here.
You've done well. Remember what I've taught you.
As for radio broadcasts and television broadcasts, they are again pretty straightforward. You'll find these things littered around the world and they'll usually just give you some extra content to enjoy. The radios, I believe, are always segments of the Pat Mays talk show, and the televisions are either Alan's crazy ramblings or reruns of the Twilight Zone clone Night Springs. All are interesting to watch or listen to, and all are pretty easy to find. Personally, with no guide, I managed to find all the radio broadcasts, so those are very noticeable. Then, for the televisions, I missed one in episode 5. You'll come to this kind of town building where Sheriff Sarah will mess with a fuse box, and you have to find some keys. You'll have the option of going up the stairs or further left. The television that I missed was up the stairs and is a bit difficult to see thanks to it being pitch black in here.
Freedom. A fusion of vigilance, conscience, and...
After that, we have the historical signs, which is where we start getting into the more tricky collectibles. There are only 25 of these, but they are tricky because they don't have any kind of indication unless you walk up to them and get the prompt to interact. This makes it very easy to miss some of the plaques on the walls unless you know what you're looking for. This one in episode 6 was the last one that I picked up, but really you're probably going to need to follow a guide for most of them. Next, we have what could be argued as the most difficult collectibles, the coffee thermoses. There are 100 of these bad boys, and they are scattered everywhere. Some of them are right in your face, hiding in plain sight, and some of them are completely off the beaten path where I'd be shocked if you were ever looking. With these, you're either going to have to use a guide, or you're going to have to put a lot of time into searching. In my opinion, there is one that I think reigns above all others in terms of its hiding spot. That one being in episode 3 as you're heading towards the meetup with the kidnapper. During the daylight portion, you'll be in a car because the distance to travel is pretty vast. While in the car, you'll come to a broken down bridge and take a detour which leads under it. In that turn though, if you walk into the woods to the edge of a cliff, you'll find a red chair, and in that red chair, you'll find a thermos. I think after my first playthrough, I'd collected like 80 or more, so most of them aren't that well hidden, but a couple are. Also, if you're wondering, you can check your progress on things like the collectibles from the statistics page on either the main menu or in the pause screen. It's not really useful for pinpointing where these collectibles are, but it's good to gauge how close you are to finishing something. And finally, we come to the other collectible, which could be argued as the hardest, the manuscript pages. With these things being tied into the story, you can of course expect a bunch of them, and you'd be right, with 106 glowing pages that you'll need to find littered around Bright Falls. Luckily, I don't think they are as well hidden as the thermoses, but they come with their own set of difficulties. The main one being that there are 15, which can only be acquired in Nightmare mode. Luckily, you're going to be going through Nightmare anyway, so it shouldn't really matter, but it will cause you to slow your run down a little. Again though, even with these difficulty-specific pages, they're almost all placed in your path or right beside it. For those that aren't, a guide is again the obvious choice, but I'll go through some that I found challenging. There's one in episode 3 after the events at the radio station. You'll have to veer right and up a long winding path to reach a radio tower where the page is at its base. Then there's one in episode 6, which is located down a path you've no need to go on just before the junkyard, past some concrete barriers. The document is near a truck at the end of the blocked off tunnel. Then, for the Nightmare exclusive ones, again in episode 6, there's one at the back side of the final generator in the game on the fence. A lot of people don't like collectibles, but I've always been kind of indifferent. So if you hate them, bad luck. With those out of the way though, let's get into what I'd guess you'd call challenge trophies. This game has a couple that are tied to doing certain actions within certain levels. To start with one that's very easy, but I missed on my first playthrough, the Medical Opinions trophy is earned in episode 4 in Hartman's office. Just before you're about to save Barry, walk into this office on the left side of the hallway to find a recording device. The machine has 3 different recordings on it, so you'll have to listen to them all in order to nab the trophy. I missed this because I didn't realize there was more than one clip on here.
Not buying that. I was tailing Wheeler, and this is the only place he could have...
Next is the Meet the Deadline trophy, where you'll have to complete the back half of episode 3 in under 30 minutes. You'll start just after the kidnapper stands you up, and you'll have to make it all the way to the end of the episode. A half hour might seem like a short time, but you can make it through the area in roughly 20 minutes, so it's not that bad. I think from the phone call to the trophy for me was something like 22. As you can guess, this is best attempted in easy mode, and it's where your practice with flares and sprinting between lights will come in prominence. Avoid combat when possible, and don't mess with things like hidden chests, and you should be able to get this one on your first attempt.
I could see Cauldron Lake. I thought I could make out the spot where the...
Another, perhaps more difficult challenge is tied to the trophy, An Idyllic Small Town, wherein you'll have to make it through the first section of episode 5 without dying. As if I need to say it, but easy is the best mode for this. Through almost the entire section, you'll be accompanied by Sheriff Sarah, who'll give you cover fire with her shotgun. The added firepower is helpful, but you should never rely on it. To me, 3 areas stand out as more challenging than the rest. That being this section, where you get pinned against a locked gate. Several enemies will mob you from the street, and you'll have to hold them off. Then there's another area where this time the church is locked, and you'll have to find the key for that. Again, you'll have to hold off Taken before finding the key. And finally, there's the helipad. You'll have to defend against another mob of enemies as Sarah gets the helicopter prepared for launch. This trophy can be tricky, but as long as you're quick to pull flares when you get overrun, aren't stingy with your equipment that's provided to you, and most importantly, play it on easy, then this is another one you should get after 1 or 2 attempts. Another somewhat challenging one is the Gunless Wonder, where you'll have to make it through basically the entire 6th episode without firing a bullet. From the outset, this likely sounds almost impossible, but with the tools that you'll have learned by the time you're going to be attempting this, you should be more than capable. A good chunk of the episode you're gonna have a car, which can safely transport you most of the distance. Then, if things seem to be getting dicey, you can always toss a flare because it doesn't count as bullets. I've also heard that flashbangs don't count, but they seemed too simple and I never tested the theory. This is another one best attempted on easy, and it follows the same strategy of run as far as you can, if you get mobbed, light a flare, then make it to the next checkpoint. This is the tried and true method of surviving in this game, and it's not going away anytime soon. Because even though this trophy should almost wrap up your list for this game, the DLC follows much the same patterns. Now, those trophies should be the bulk of your difficulties towards the actual Platinum Trophy. There are some gun things like killing 2 enemies with 1 shotgun bullet, but if you keep it in the back of your mind as you're running through all the other trophies, then the opportunity will knock at some point. And so, with the base game thoroughly illuminated, let's move into the DLC. If you've never played it, these 2 side adventures are a lot like the base game, but with less story. I think they're also quite a bit shorter than a normal episode, with the 2 of them together probably equaling the length of just one from base. The trophies also follow very similar guidelines to their main game counterparts. To begin with the Signal, you've got 2 trophies just for beating it, 4 trophies for doing some kind of challenge, and then 2 more trophies for getting the collectibles. Luckily for this, you don't need to worry about difficulty, so if you want to do it in easy, or normal, or even nightmare if you're some kind of masochist, feel free. To start with the collectibles, you'll need to be on the lookout for 6 cardboard cutouts of characters from the base game, as well as 10 alarm clocks. The cutouts are pretty large, so as long as you're explorative, you should be able to sniff them out. The alarm clocks, on the other hand, are a lot like the thermoses, but a little smaller. You'll get the glimmer effect, but some are off the beaten path, so a guide would be best. To go on to the challenges, the easiest is probably License Revoked, wherein you can't drive a car for the duration of the episode. Luckily, there's only one area where driving a car is even possible, and if you're playing on easy, you really won't need it. It's an open area, and 2 possessed trucks will spawn here, but you'll have a powerful flashlight, so if necessary, you can smoke them from the safety of the power switch shelter. Then, prior to that in this episode, is another challenge tied to this furnace area under the church. This place has oodles of interactable possible furnace explosions, and for the Words Will Never Harm You trophy, your job is to ignite them all. As long as you take the time to eliminate the enemies in the area when they appear, this is really just a matter of checking the entire area. It's simple, but perhaps a bit tedious. To get into some less simple trophies though, we next have Fast and Furious, wherein you'll need to defeat the horror at the sawmill in under 1:30. The sawmill being the final fight of the DLC, where you're fighting yourself from the TV. This fight is kind of challenging, but the real secret here is to use the flare gun. For me, it only took 1 shot per stage to knock all the flying televisions out. However, it should certainly be noted that this type of ammo is very limited in this DLC, and I don't think you find any in this area. Instead, you'll have to start planning for this fight way back in the town when you first get the flare gun after the first manuscript page. This gun comes with 2 shots, and they may be the only ones that you can even find. So, from the very beginning, save that ammo for this fight. Then, once you get outside, use the flashlight in combination with the normal flares to take out the boat, and you should be able to snag this one fairly easily. This only leaves us with one more trophy here, but unfortunately it's the most difficult one, Run-On Sentence. For this, you're gonna have to go through the entire DLC with no deaths. Again, you'll want to play this on easy, and you'll want to use the flare to checkpoint method. Personally, I think the biggest struggles here are the section with all the light poles, as well as the final fight. For the light pole area, the road that you'll need to travel is long and winding, with a lot of enemies chucking knives at you left and right. Luckily, you can peel them off your back if you time the lights kicking on correctly, but you can't necessarily rely on it. So using a flare when it's getting grim is probably still the best strategy. As for the final fight, I think the flare gun method is the best method. If you let the fight drag on, then the constantly respawning enemies and flying debris will likely overwhelm you. So the quickest way to escape this death trap is the best way to avoid untimely demise. Personally, this took me 2 attempts, but my first wasn't a death to enemies, but rather a death to poor platforming performance. I fell off this crane kind of puzzle, but caught it with a pause which tested a theory. If I restarted the checkpoint before a true death, would it still give me the trophy? That answer being no. So if you're wondering, at least from my experience, you can't get the trophy if you restart a checkpoint, so just keep that in mind. Fortunately, this DLC is maybe a half hour long, skipping the cutscenes, and I managed to mind the gap on my next go-around, nabbing me this trophy. With the signal completed, we now move on to the writer, which is, in some ways easier, and in some ways more difficult. This time we have 9 trophies, with 2 being tied to completing the actual episode, 6 being tied to doing specific things along the way, and only 1 being tied to a collectible. So to start with the collectibles, this time around you're hunting for video games. To be specific, a video game based on the events of the TV show from the base game, Night Springs. They function like thermoses or alarm clocks, and there are 10 of them to locate here. In my opinion, these are the most well hidden yet though. Of course, you'll want to follow a guide, but I'll show you 2 that are of particular note. After you escape Hartman's clinic, you'll have a small discussion with Zane before a little platforming section spawns in. Here, there's a cabin, and once you jump inside of it, it rotates. For the video game, you'll need to jump into that building and get it to start rotating, then jump back out so that you can hop on the roof where the collectible is located. I don't think I'd have ever noticed this one without a guide. The second is just after a log lift section where you'll come to a bridge. You'll have to walk down the bridge and around a big truck hauling some logs and find the video game on its backside. Most of the others are in locations that it's possible you'll explore, but the cabin and the bridge are the ones that I found harder. However, my final one was right at the end of the DLC, just before you approach the Cauldron Lake cabin. You'll have to go up the hill behind you and find it on the overlook. Once you've finished with the collectibles, the next task will be the challenges. Like I said, we've got 6 here, and we'll start with the most simple, that being Heartbreaker. Near the end of the game, you'll come to a hallway which leads to a therapy session between Hartman and Alice, who has a TV for a head. For this trophy, all you'll need to do is stick around while she tells Hartman her issues with Alan, and then play the tape recorder when given the option.
And that was all that mattered. What I heard in there wasn't the truth. It was just another toxic mirage. It cut deep, but that made me...
Another simple one would be Creative Space, wherein you'll need to find a secret little cave. You'll come to a downed plane later in the episode and have to cross its wing. Once you've crossed, the path leads to the right, but if you go to the left into the rocks, you'll find a hidden pathway. Continuing along it, and you will eventually come to a small cave room with a massive typewriter and net yourself the bronze.
I felt like the typewriter was mocking me. I was supposed to be calling the shots.
After that, the difficulty ramps up a bit more. Once you've ignited the lighthouse, you'll have the opportunity to get the Go Gently Into That Good Light trophy. Here, you'll need to not fire your weapon from the point when you light the lighthouse to the point when you arrive there. If you've not played this section, then this may sound harsh to you, but the beam from the lighthouse auto-kills the enemies that are unlucky enough to get in its path. That means your real goal here is to clear rubble when given the option so that the light can do its job. Of course, you can still use flares if it gets dicey, but after maybe an attempt or 2, this is easily accomplishable.
The lighthouse. I was relieved to have made it here, but I wasn't sure what was going on.
Next up is a whirlwind, where you're tasked with going through the tornado in a short amount of time, which I believe is 60 seconds. The tornado being shortly after the rotating cabin near the start of the episode. With a time limit, this can seem a bit stressful because obviously, Alan Wake wasn't a game built for platforming. If you're able to hit the jumps though, this is fairly straightforward. After the manuscript page drops and the tornado objects spawn, illuminate the first floating word near the platform to spawn a metal walkway. Jump on that, and once you have your footing, start looking up and illuminating the words above you so that they're ready when you reach them. Once you've gone a little ways around, look forward and spawn the path before climbing up the ladder. An enemy will come out around this building to your left, and it's fastest just to bring out the shotgun and knock him off the platform. Continue along the walkways, and you'll get to the platform that you hopefully illuminated earlier. Jumping successfully from them onto the next path, if done in the appropriate amount of time, should net you the trophy. With that out of the way, the next challenge should be the Iron Will trophy, which is given for beating the final boss area without your health dipping into the red. Once you're back at Cauldron Lake, just outside of the cabin, you'll be attacked by several shadow versions of characters from the base game. Your mission is to beat them all without dipping into the lowest fourth of your health bar. This is one that I would highly suggest tackling in easy mode because this can be a bit troublesome in higher difficulties. The sequence of enemies goes Shadow Hartman, both the Anderson brothers, and then Barry times 3. There will also be some Raven troops that fly around, attacking indiscriminately. The biggest tip here would be to just keep your high beams on for the entire thing. There's a limitless battery spawn near where you first enter the area, and knocking the darkness off the baddies is the biggest challenge. This is your last fight in the DLC, and this place is also littered with ammo, so use everything that you have to your disposal to get it over as quickly as possible. In my opinion, the Anderson brothers fight is the most difficult here, since it's difficult to focus your light on both of them at the same time. Just make sure that you're tossing flares at the first sign of injury, and with a little luck, you should be able to wrap this up quickly. And now for the final and most difficult trophy from this list, No Punctuation, wherein you'll have to handle the entire DLC without dying. For me, this was actually easier in this episode than it was in the previous one, but it does have its own caveats. For starters, a lot of the writer's design is for some reason focused around Alan's jumping ability, specifically the tornado that we covered a minute ago, and this Ferris wheel house. For the tornado, just take your time and make sure of your jumps, but the real challenge is the Ferris wheel house. There's one section in particular that I've died on several times, and I don't know if it's because I'm dumb or because you're required to take damage here. You'll come to this area where you'll have to fall through the floor onto a metal walkway. I always take damage here. Then you have to climb the wall once it's rotated enough and jump through a doorway onto these vents. The issue is trying to jump straight through the second door because if you land too low on the vents, since you've already taken damage, you'll likely die from the fall. What's worked for me in the past though is jumping through the second door as far right as possible so that you'll land on the upper part of the vents. Then, as the room rotates, make your way down the hall to the vault. If you want to play around with it and find an easier way, I'd assume that you could, but for me, this is the strategy that I took. Luckily, other than these areas, I'd say that the combat in this DLC is less intense, so as long as you can manage these platforming areas, you should be able to pull this off without too many errors. And there you have it, the final trophy of the final DLC. Alan Wake is one of those games that I think is going to someday fade into the back recesses of my mind. But that doesn't mean that I dislike the game, just that it doesn't leave too strong of a lasting impression, and the same goes for its trophies. Nothing that this game throws at you should take you more than max 3 attempts. It doesn't have impossible trophies or long grinds, but it has a list that meshes well with what the game is, in my opinion. Anyway, thank you all for watching my second absurdly long video on Alan Wake Remastered. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you all in the next one.